We are convening this assembly on the opening day of the Second International Migration Review Forum for a strategic reason: to take stock of achievements, identify persistent challenges, and co-create forward-looking strategies to strengthen gender-responsive migration governance globally. So our goal is clear: to ensure that gender justice remains central to this week's discussions and the shaping of future commitments. To do so, we have structured the assembly in an interactive manner with time assigned to collectively develop key messages and priority asks for the gender-responsive implementation of the Global Compact for Migration. We have invited a stellar lineup of speakers who will set the stage for this engagement through their expertise on relevant areas that actually emerged as part of several preparation sessions that we held ahead of the forum. And these areas include borders, AI and technology, statelessness, disability, narratives and media, sexual and reproductive health, climate, faith-based approaches, and data. And on the latter, and specifically regarding its importance in the review of the process of the compact, I have the honor to say a few introductory words and share some findings from our research, which includes the launch of the Global Compact for Migration Gender Snapshots, which we're happy to do here today with you. These snapshots are the first of their kind and were conducted using our Gender Migration Index, a participatory policy guidance tool for gender responsiveness and migrant inclusion. We developed the index in the context of the first International Migration Review Forum in 2022, given the then absence of a monitoring and evaluation framework for the compact. The Gender Migration Index addresses the needs and challenges of women, girls, LGBTQIA+, and gender diverse migrants through a comprehensive indicator system that centers migrants' lived experiences through participatory action research. The index is thus co-curated in its methodology and results in outputs such as the gender snapshots. It highlights both overall gender responsiveness as well as policy-specific gender responsiveness. And so since the first International Migration Review Forum in 2022, we have now analyzed over 70 member states and their implementation of the compact based on this indicator system across 5 policy areas: education, labor, trafficking, GBV, and health. And our analyses were based on voluntary national reviews submitted as they serve to demonstrate progress in the implementation of the Global Compact for Migration, and because they are state-led, so states themselves write these progress report. And so today we're launching the findings from this research, again, which we have titled the Global Compact for Migration Gender Snapshots. And what did we find? We find that across the regions, there's lots of red, meaning limited gender responsive implementation of the compact. And we'll show you the snapshots region by region, and then we'll also present, so first our baseline findings and then the comparative findings in just a moment. So let's begin with Africa. And rather than analyzing these slides in depth, because I think they speak volumes just by what you can see here, and the countries are ranked top to bottom, for each of these regions, I will identify one key pattern that we believe is important to highlight. For Africa, a key pattern to observe is that although the overall level of gender responsiveness in the implementation of the compact might appear promising for some countries, this is not necessarily reflected in specific policy areas. And this is because we found significant add-on language in the sense of mixing gender dynamics into the document without specifics on how they're actually considered in targeted policy areas. For the Arab states, as defined by the UN, I'm just making sure we follow. Excellent. We also see this pattern. However, what stands out is the near absence of gender responsive implementation in the education sector, a main space for social cohesion. And all of this will be published in full. I'm just giving a brief kind of overview of some of these key findings. In Asia Pacific, the patterns identified in the other two regions similarly emerge, with the note that here, the gender responsive implementation of the compact in terms of addressing gender-based violence was particularly limited. And then I'll conclude with the final two regions, Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as Europe Plus or UNECE. Here we found that overall levels of gender responsiveness in the implementation of the compact appeared promising in selected countries, but with change in political leadership, this progress has been stalled. And this is the case, for instance, for Argentina, in Latin America and the Caribbean, and then in Europe, we saw this same pattern in the context of Germany. So this is what we found. This is the baseline from what we see from 2022. And I will now pass it to my colleague, Snehal Tote, who will provide insights from our preliminary comparative snapshots from 2022 to 2026, again, based on the voluntary national reviews that were already submitted ahead of this second International Migration Review Forum, and the migration index that we used. So you will only see a selected country case study comparison at this point, but we will finish that analysis very soon to show even more patterns of progress or regress, depending on what we find. Snehal, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lara. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Snehal. I will jump straight into the comparison. So we're on slide 8 now. As many of you probably know, the 2026 VNRs were only recently made available online, so we could not conduct a comprehensive analysis for all the countries. But still, to get some sense of how things have changed in the last 4 years, we compared the VNRs of the worst performing country from each region with its 2026 update, except for Asia Pacific and Latin America and the Caribbean, for which the 2026 VNRs of Tonga and Colombia, respectively, were not available at the time of the analysis. As you can see here, there is some progress for Chad, Morocco, and Uruguay. However, in Uzbekistan, the one circle that was yellow in 2022 turned red in 2026 because Uzbekistan had no mention of gender, nor engagement or commitment related to it. Conveniently for the Netherlands, everything remained red, same as 2022. Since Morocco turned quite colorful in 2026, let's quickly look at what has changed. We can go to slide 9. Thank you, Carolina. In terms of context, in 2022, Morocco's VNR did not engage with gender, although there was one mention of sex disaggregated data for COVID-19 vaccines. But in 2026, we found 31 references to words such as gender, women, and even sexual and reproductive health. As for engagement, in 2022, Morocco's VNR did talk about trafficking, but it was done without any reference to women or girls who make over 60% of trafficking victims in the country. Thankfully, in 2026, this was not the case because we found improvement in terms of policy engagement, specifically for trafficking, health, and labor. Some examples of this engagement include creation of safe shelters for victims of trafficking with specialized counseling and support, training and education for peer educators and migrant leaders on sexual and reproductive health and GBV, creation of inclusive nurseries to remove childcare barriers, to empower women to enter the workforce, creation of data sets targeting specific vulnerability of women and girls, including gendered climate risk, which is new, and focused interventions to integrate women into the formal financial system. We found that this was possible because Morocco worked with specialized UN agencies such as UN Women, UNFPA, local organizations, and even integrated informal migrant-led networks, showing that change is possible when member states are willing to make it happen. However, this engagement is mostly focused on vulnerability and protection. Still, a lot needs to happen to actually integrate women, girls, and gender diverse persons as active stakeholders who shape discussions, policy, and on-ground implementation. Therefore, we should target interventions and advocacy at the IMRF this year to push just for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Snehal, for this initial comparison of what we see. And Snehal conducted several other country comparisons as well that we'll be releasing very, very, very soon. With this overview of our global compact for migration, gender snapshots, and what we are seeing, we will now pass it to our experts in the room who will, and online, obviously, who will be speaking to particular areas that we found to be often overlooked when we're talking about the gender responsive implementation of the compact. And it is a cross-cutting principle, but with that also comes intersectionality and different nexuses that we need to consider. We do actually have all of our in-person speakers here now, but we did also promise our colleagues online who are in different parts of the world where it might be a little bit later in the day that we would welcome them first, and then we will move to the in-person. This will also give our colleagues who are in person a little bit of time to take a break from the other meetings and all the discussions already taking place. This said, we will move to our first expert input speaker online, Elham Yousefian from the International Refugee Assistance Project, who will highlight the area of disability inclusion when we're talking about gender responsiveness in the Global Compact for Migration. Elham, you have the floor. We welcome you.
Thank you very much. Can you confirm that you can hear me and see me well?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Good morning to colleagues in the room, and good afternoon, evening to colleagues online. I'm very excited for this opportunity to talk about women with disabilities and migration, especially on gender-based violence. I mean, I could spend a lot of time to talk about the experience of women with disabilities in migration, but I have to focus on the gender-based violence. So very quickly, I just want to add that sometimes there is this assumption that women with disabilities maybe do not migrate as much as other women or as much as men, maybe. But that assumption is not true because, first of all, many women with disabilities choose to migrate in order to access a more accessible life with better opportunities in a world that they hope it's more fair, accessible, and built for people with disabilities, not only physically built, but also from attitudinal point of view and from legal and policy point of view. Second of all, women with disabilities are very much targeted for trafficking in person, especially for things like forced begging or other forms of forced labor. But unfortunately, there is no data available on how many women with disabilities are subject to trafficking in person. Another angle is that many women with disabilities are being forced by the rest of the family to migrate, denying their autonomy, because this is an issue that actually happens a lot for people with disabilities, that their agency, autonomy, and decision-making is being denied and being treated as children, as if others can figure what is the best interest of them. They usually face a lot of challenges to have their will and preference governing their life decisions. And that also includes the migration. Many women with disabilities experience gender-based violence throughout the migration journey and also when they arrive to their destinations. One thing that I have to clarify here is that according to different studies, women with disabilities experience 2, and even in some cases up to 10 times more likely to experience sexual and gender-based violence compared to other women, especially women with intellectual disabilities and women with mental health condition are very likely to be subject to sexual and gender-based violence. And then they're going to face a lot of challenges in reporting. And when the migration angle is also added, these barriers even are higher, including lack of access to information about like barrier of reporting opportunities that are available for them, lack of capacity among the organizations who support. So organizations who support women who are subject to gender-based violence usually do need a little bit of support and capacity development to support migrant women and understand how they experience gender-based violence. And when you add the disability angle, that challenge is getting even more difficult. For example, let me give you one quick example. Like deaf women, as we know, use sign language to communicate. And in many gender-based violence services and support organizations, support networks, there is the big challenge of providing sign language interpretation for survivors who are deaf. And then, when a woman is migrant, most likely they are not able to speak and understand the sign language of the destination country or the country that they're currently living in. For example, we have had many cases that American Sign Language interpretation have been offered to a deaf woman who speaks Arabic Sign Language, with the misunderstanding that sign language is something international, which is not true. Sign language, we have as many signs as we have spoken languages. So, I mean, we just have like 3 to 5 minutes, and there's no way that I can cover everything in this limited time. But I want to leave you with a few quick suggestions and recommendations for future research and advocacy. First of all, I think this is a very under-researched topic. The intersection of gender and disability with migration definitely needs to be researched more, and also any studies on gender-based violence definitely needs to have a disability angle. So I highly recommend prioritizing these topics and suggest a twin-track approach, which means not only specific research and data collection on how women with disabilities experience gender-based violence throughout the migration process, but also mainstreaming disability in any other studies. So not just limiting ourselves to specific targeted studies, but also mainstreaming disability in the studies. And in terms of advocacy, I would highly recommend connecting and building partnerships with women with disabilities organizations, and also supporting migrant-led organizations and networks to become inclusive, accessible, and participatory for those women with disabilities. So I would just wrap it up at this point and would look forward to further engagement with the rest of the colleagues.
Thank you very much, Elham. And for sticking with time, we truly appreciate it. And we know there's more always to say. With that, we'll pass it to our next speaker, Janatu Ferdous from Columbia University, who will highlight the area of AI and technology. We welcome you.
Thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning. Actually, good evening from Bangladesh. Thank you so much for convening this important assembly. Today, I would like to reflect on what I call digital borders. That the expanding use of artificial intelligence, biometric systems, and digital platforms in migration governance, and how these are reshaping migrant experiences in ways that are profoundly gendered yet still insufficiently examined. Across the world, migration management is rapidly becoming digitalized. From biometric registration in refugee camps to algorithmic risk profiling in visa and asylum decisions, these systems are often presented as neutral, efficient, and objective solution. However, evidence, particularly from Global South, suggests a more complex and troubling reality. Digital technologies are not developed in a vacuum. They are embedded within existing social, political, and economic inequalities. As a result, they are frequently reproduced and, in some cases, intensify those inequalities. Digital systems are not gender neutral, as we all know. They encode bias often invisibly. For instance, biometric technologies can struggle to accurately capture the identities of women engaged in informal or manual labor, where worn fingerprints or limited documentation create barriers to recognition. At the same time, AI-driven decision-making systems trained on historically biased data sets may reinforce discriminatory assumptions about risk, credibility, or vulnerability. These systems can influence who is granted mobility, who receives protection, and who remains excluded, often without transparency or meaningful avenues for appeal. These challenges are even more acute for marginalized populations, including displaced women, persons with disabilities, and undocumented migrants. Many face limited access to digital devices, lower levels of digital literacy, and heightened exposure to surveillance. In such contexts, digitalization can inadvertently deepen exclusion rather than promote inclusion. A relevant example can be observed in refugee context, including among displaced population in Bangladesh, where biometric registration has become central to aid distribution and identity verification. While such systems have improved administrative efficiency, they have also revealed gender gaps, particularly for women who face mobility constraint, cultural barriers, or technological unfamiliarity. This illustrates a broader point: when digital systems fail to account for lived realities, they risk reinforcing the very vulnerabilities they are meant to address. In this sense, digital borders do more than regulate movement, they reshape power, visibility, and access to rights. They determine who is legible to the system and who remains invisible. However, it is important to emphasize that technology itself is not inherently harmful. When designed and governed responsibly, digital tools can enhance protection, improve service delivery, and strengthen institutional accountability. The critical question, therefore, is not whether to adopt digital technologies in migration governance, but how to do so in ways that are just, inclusive, and right-based. Based on emerging research and policy insight, I would like to highlight three key priorities. Firstly, we must embed gender-sensitive design at every stage of digital migration systems. This requires recognizing diverse identities, addressing data gaps, and actively incorporating the lived experiences of women and marginalized groups into technological development and implementation. And secondly, we must establish robust ethical and governance framework for the use of AI in migration. Transparency, accountability, and human oversight are also essential, particularly in high-stakes decisions that affect mobility, protection, and legal status. Without these safeguards, efficiency gains may come at the cost of fairness and justice. And third important issue is here: we must bridge the digital divide. expanding equitable access to technology, enhancing digital literacy, and ensuring inclusive infrastructure are critical to preventing digital systems from becoming new mechanisms of exclusion. Finally, what is needed is a right-based and feminist approach to digital migration governance. One that prioritizes dignity, equity, and justice over efficiency alone, and that critically interrogates whose interests are being served by digital transformation. As we move towards the IMRF and beyond, I urge this assembly to recognize that the future of migration governance is not only about managing borders. It is about shaping digital systems and that uphold human rights and leave no one behind. That's all from my side. Thank you so much for giving me opportunity to speak about this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janatul, for these excellent insights. Technology. We will actually stay in the context of Bangladesh, and we'll pass it now the floor to Murshid Alam from the Rohingya Youth Union, RYU, who will highlight the area of statelessness and offer share-outs from their recent community convening in Cox's Bazar refugee camp as part of our global Gender and Migration Forum, which just took place. The convening just took place this weekend. So thank you, Murshid, for being here. We'll pass it to you.
Thank you, dear distinguished speakers, participants, and guests. Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. I am speaking here on behalf of Rohingya Youth Union, based in Cox's Bazar, the world's largest refugee settlements in Bangladesh, bringing voice from Rohingya communities here at the global stage. For us, migration is not a choice. It is the result of persecutions, genocide, displacement, and statelessness. Statelessness affects every part of our lives that we survive every day. Without legal identity, women face greater barriers to safety and services. Youth face limited access to education, opportunity. Communities remain excluded from decision makings and also from economic growth and many things. So while gender responsive migration is not recognized globally, it often does not reach stateless communities. Because without this legal identity, this effort remains incomplete. This is why we choose Global Compact for Migration, which is objective 4, is critical for us. We must ensure access to legal identity and documentation for all from the marginalized background, especially for the Rohingya community in the world's largest refugee settlement in Cox's Bazar. Because without this legal identity, there is no full access to rights, no meaningful protection, no meaningful participation of refugee in the decision-making space, and no real inclusion rather than exclusion. From our community dialogue, we share 4 key messages, which is prioritizing legal identity for a statelessness community, especially for the Rohingya community, include women and youth in decision-making space, invest in education and opportunities, support community-led solutions, and youth-led initiative. From our community convening dialogues, we share this key message. So let me now end with a message from our community convening, from the participants share with us. From the camp to the who said from the camp to the global platform, our voice matter. So if migration governance is truly gender responsive, it must include those without identity. So thank you so much. This is from all my sides. And thank you again for all the opportunity and hearing me from my first experience, all this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Thank you so much for convening this community session. We have so much to learn from you. We will hear next from Martina Dominici, an independent expert who will highlight the area of media and narratives when we're talking about the gender responsive implementation of the Global Compact for Migration. Welcome, Martina. You have the floor.
Could you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Great, let's start. I know you may be expecting inputs or answers from me, but I like to start with a few questions. Question that I hope will spark a reflection that will stay with you even after we leave this digital or physical room. Ready? Now we count 3 seconds. Close your eyes and think about the last article you read about migration. Now think about this article and ask yourself, do you remember if the story was backed up with data and whenever it was disaggregated? Do you remember if women migrants or migrants with diverse subjects were featured or quoted? And if they were, what role did they play? Were they portrayed as victims or as individuals with agency, leadership, and contributions? Why have I started with this reflection? Because the Global Compact for Migration is explicit on this. Through its gender-responsive principle, it calls for moving beyond a victimhood lens and recognizes the agency, leadership, and empowerment of all migrant women and girls. Moreover, through its Objective 17, it called for promoting an evidence-based public discourse on migration and migrants that generate a more realistic, humane, and constructive perception. Despite all of this, media still mainly relied on aggregate numbers on migration due to data gaps. The lack of data on gender and migration remains a major challenge that leads to the invisibility of marginalized groups and hides structural issues. Moreover, migrants, women, and underrepresented in media narratives, and migrants with diverse subjects are almost invisible. Lastly, when migrant women are presented, they are often portrayed as passive subjects, framed as victims or dependents, rather than full actors with agency. But why this is a governance issue? Because narratives on migration are not neutral, and bias or stereotypical media coverage has an impact. First, an impact on public attitudes, as it narrows public understanding of migration, leading to ignoring the broader structural realities that shape why people move and the challenge that they face. When migrant women are shown only as a victim or dependent, society begins to see them that way, dismissing their contribution and reinforcing stigma. Secondly, it has an impact on policymaking. If migrant women and migrants with diverse subjects are mainly absent from the media, their needs and voices are excluded from decision-making process, resulting in fewer protection and more gaps in support. And lastly, of course, this directly impacts migrant lives. I would like to conclude with 3 priority asks that, at least to me, should become concrete commitments for government and stakeholders. First, invest in training, guidelines, and accountability mechanisms to promote gender-responsive and ethical migration reporting. Second, create space for migrant voices. Migrant women and migrants with diverse subjects must not only be present, but be active shapers of narratives. And third and last one, collect and disseminate gender data and migration and strengthen research and partnership to ensure that public discourse on migration is evidence-based and non-discriminatory. That's all from my side, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Martina. especially for leading us through this powerful opening exercise. We will now pass it to our last speaker from the virtual space, Valerie Dourdin from the International Planned Parenthood Federation, who will highlight the area of sexual and reproductive health. Thank you, Valerie. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. So the International Planned Parenthood Federation is the largest federation of sexual reproductive health and rights. We have members association from 150 countries who are national organizations working for sexual and reproductive health. It's clear that migration have become a larger problem in most of those countries. You don't choose to be an irregular migrant. You need to move because of economic reasons, persecutions, and other reasons. Women goes for more than 50% of migrants. And that's why IPPF have decided to put together a program in 15 countries around Africa and the Arab world, and in South America and Central America to support sexual and gender-based violence for women on the move. The reason we decided to do that is we have seen how important it is to open our clinics to migrant women. Being an irregular migrant means that you don't have access to health and you have less access to sexual reproductive health. Already into normal time and in emergencies, sexual and reproductive health is not considered an emergency services. And we're trying to push to make understand that it's a need and it's also an emergency for many women. We have to get out a little bit of this idea of only emergency is for shelter, food, medicines and water. It's also sexual reproductive health, and it is for women on the move and girls. We've seen more and more intersectionality into the migrants that are on the move, and the need to look at that intersectionality and also in the sexual reproductive health. It's also important to say that sexual and reproductive health have been getting out of many agenda into the UN, have been out of a lot of agenda also in the migration field. And that's why this program for us is so important, to push countries to look into sexual reproductive health for migrant women and girls. For example, in Mexico, last year, over 52 girls under 13 years old were pregnant, Guatemalan girls into Mexico. This is a reality also of migration, and we want to make sure that we respond to that. We respond to the need of LGBTQI communities migrating, and youth and women who are also migrating and have a need of sexual reproductive health services. It's important for us into that program to look at the diversity. This program is going to work with sexual workers in Nigeria or migrants who migrate and come back and need also support in sexual reproductive health. Women who are in transit or stuck in countries like Morocco, and also how the governments are looking at sexual and reproductive health into their legislation in their country for migrants. So again, we think that it's very important, the meeting that we're having and the influence that it can have to the MF and the migration, international migration group, and to ensure that sexual and reproductive health has a center stage into the resolutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Valerie, for the important work that you do. And we were very excited to hear that you will co-sponsor this event and that we got in touch with you. We will now turn to our speakers who are here in person. And we will first hear from Dr. Christina Iona Dragomir from New York University, who will highlight the area of climate. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me here. It was really lovely hearing all these voices that we have heard online right now. So as Lara Susan said, my work looks at the intersection of gender, mobility, and climate and environmental disasters. And I want to highlight two places where these intersections are visible. First is the Sundarbans Island in India, which are islands that are slowly sinking into rising water, and the Carpathian communities in Romania, villages hit by landslides and floods, and are contaminated by toxic waste left behind by decades of extraction. Here, patterns of migration, immobility, and mobility have been embedded along gendered lines, with men often leaving for work and women remaining in the affected areas. These places are thousands of kilometers apart. The challenges they face are different, but in both, I met women doing the same kind of work, holding everything together, their families, their households, their animals, their land, while the ground, quite literally, sometimes shifted beneath their feet. With men away for work, women carry the weight of survival. Women quickly learn how to navigate institutions, build local alliances, organize remittances, and manage migration networks. Women are resilient, adaptive, determined to sustain life, their own, the life of their communities, and of the earth itself.
I know we asked for very short input from an academic, so I know how that goes.
Yeah. So, and we discuss these situations, especially as academics, as in the language of crisis: climate, migration, conflict, and gender inequality. But what I think that defines this moment in history is the political connections that exist between all of them. This crisis revealed how our societies are organized, whose life we choose to protect, whose lives and vulnerabilities we allow ourselves to ignore. These are politically created and structurally developed through war, extraction, inequality, and political exclusion. And because these conditions are politically produced, they can also be transformed politically through politics and policies. Therefore, I think that the persistent challenge, as Lara Suzanne highlighted for us, in my view, is the recognition of climate and environmental displacement, forced mobility and immobility as legal and political categories that are always inclusive of gender. This recognition, I find, that is the foundation, because without it, the realities will remain invisible in governance. People, and women particularly, and girls, will remain unprotected, unaccounted for, and structurally excluded from response. While women are disproportionately affected by displacement, forced mobility and immobility, poverty and violence, we all know this, the data is very clear. They're also political actors within these conditions. But without the legal and political recognition, their work remains unsupported and excluded from governance, and therefore from any form of structural transformation. And the persistent challenges that we face today will persist without legal and political categorization. We need, therefore, to build gender-inclusive systems that can recognize, govern, and respond these realities as legal and political categories. Because ultimately, I think that the challenge is not to manage one crisis or another, but is to make sure that we create a shared future that is politically possible. And that begins with politically and legally recognizing and resourcing the women that are already doing this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will next hear from Kirsten Dimowitz from the Border Violence Monitoring Network, who will highlight the area of borders.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm Kirsten. I represent the Border Violence Monitoring Network. We are a coalition of around 20 human rights organizations based at the EU's external borders. And we document pushbacks, which are illegal collective expulsions. After a migrant or a refugee has crossed the border, they are now in EU territory. They request asylum. They're rounded up, pushed back violently, often across the border, back into Turkey, into North Africa, into the Balkans, into Belarus. We're also documenting from Poland now. So my interventions will be about the testimonies that we collect with people, which are from our gender-based violence centers, from our food distributions, from medical care. Once they come back across the border, beaten by the border authorities, I want to name the perpetrator very clearly too. And so this is where the information is coming from. We talked a little bit about data earlier, and there's something that's missing in our data too, and that's often the voices of women, because they are so hard to reach. So we have hundreds of testimonies that represent tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who have experienced this. but only 8% of them actually come from a woman herself, because they're hard to reach in the field. They are going through smuggling networks, they are at risk of traffickers, they're experiencing violence by authorities in their home countries and now also in the European Union, and they don't trust even coming to our services to speak to us. So most of what I share about them is secondhand information from people who were traveling with them, who witnessed this. I also want to talk about the difference between rhetoric and practice. So the European Union likes to tout its global human rights. It often acts as a pillar of that. It will champion some of the things in the global compact, but the practice and the reality is very different from what they say out loud. And I again want to name the perpetrator. Some organizations and people would like to say that women experience vulnerabilities as if they exist just kind of out in the ether because they're women. The perpetrator in this case is the state. It is the border officials. It is the army. It is the police. It is not random other migrants. It is the authorities that are meant to protect civilians who are harming them. So I want to start with a story that represents hundreds of stories and women that we've worked with. So a woman is traveling with her children. She's unnamed in our records to protect her, and she's been displaced for more than 5 years. She's crossed multiple borders, at least 2 or 3 in the last 3 years, and now she's attempting to cross into Europe with her children. Whether that's from Turkey to Greece, Turkey to Bulgaria, Belarus, Poland, the Balkans, into Europe, the pattern is the same, documented across all of our testimonies. She crosses into European territory. She's stopped by authorities, national police, border guards, sometimes Frontex. Her belongings are taken and then burned in front of her. Her phone is destroyed, so she has no access to communicate with anyone. She's blindfolded, put into a van, driven to an unknown location, sometimes a random building in the forest, sometimes actually a police center. So the coordination of the state authorities is obvious. She's then forced to undress in front of male officers and other migrant men that she's traveling with and her own children. She's forcibly searched all over her body in front of these people. And in some instances after this, there's further sexual violence and sometimes rape by the very authorities who are meant to protect her. And after she has expressed a willingness and an eagerness to claim asylum. So multiple violations here at the same time are happening. It's not an outlier case, unfortunately. I have hundreds of cases like this representing tens of thousands of people. Another woman I want to share about, a 28-year-old Ethiopian woman, crossed into Poland in 2023 with a group of other people. When her health deteriorated, she could no longer walk. So the group decided to carry on and look for the authorities to claim asylum and to leave her in the forest. When they found the police and the border authorities, they told them about this woman and they asked for them to find and help her, and they also requested asylum. They were ignored. The border guards pushed the group back into Belarus, forcibly, violently, took all their clothes, made them walk hundreds of kilometers without their shoes and clothes. And they never went searching for this woman. Her body was found by our group of activists on February 12th, 2025. She died alone in the forest inside the European Union because border officers decided that an illegal collective expulsion and keeping migrants out was more important than her life. This is not an isolated incident. I've said it many times, but it's repeated over and over. 70% of our testimonies explicitly reference sexual assault. So not only are they being denied access to asylum, there's gender-based violence, forcible searches, and other abuses I won't go into more detail here. 85% of our cases involving women include torture or ill treatment, beaten, severe injuries, pushed into chest-high freezing rivers, stripped in sub-zero temperatures. Another example, a Somali woman told officers she had experienced rape and begged them not to be returned. They pushed her back in handcuffs in the winter into a swamp by herself. So these are not abuses happening by bad actors or in spite of state policy. They are state policy. So what we're asking here for today is very basic. We want access to asylum, not just in the text, but real access to asylum. And non-regression. So this is a basic ask of the GCM, but can we just agree to do the things we agree to do? We don't want it to weaken any more of existing protections. The GCM is not binding, but international law is, and that's what all of these things are based on. And we want some accountability. We have this documentation. We know that it happens. It happens at borders around the world. Who's being held accountable for it? So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kirsten, especially for uplifting and amplifying these testimonies in this space, and your call, I believe, is very clear. So thank you so much. We will hear, last but not least, from our colleague from the ACT Alliance, Carol Arambulla, I hope who will highlight faith-based approaches as a key component when we're talking about the gender-responsive implementation of the compact. Please,
Thank
Carol.
you so much.
Thank you for
Laura,
having us.
apologies for showing up late. It's a busy week for everyone, but it's also a time to reflect. We're in a very hectic context. I think we all know that, but what allows me, coming from a faith-based organization, is looking at ways in which we can provide hope, we can provide unity and dignity. The ACT Alliance is a global faith-based coalition present in 125 countries with 164 members. We have one here from Argentina in the room, who are working around 5 priorities: peace and security, humanitarian response, gender justice, climate justice, and migration and displacement. Among those members that we have, of course, we have churches, but we also have humanitarian organizations. So what I'm going to share with you today aligns to the work that our members are doing on the ground. We have both international members as well as local members from different faiths who are coming together to work on these 5 priorities. And this allows us to see 2 things that are very, very relevant in this context. The first one is the fact that, yes, we have discussed here and over there at the UN extensively about the consequences of bad policy when it comes to migration governance, translated into human rights violations, translated into political confrontations, but also translated into a second standpoint, which is it is not only migrants who are suffering these consequences, it's the solidarity movements that accompany them. Whether they're NGOs, whether they're churches, whether they're leaders, activist movements, people who put their bodies on the line to protect others. So the attacks are coming from 2 fronts, and I think that's important to say. And across all that spectrum, we see that women are unfortunately, again, just like in any other issues, the most affected by this trend. So, but yet, despite what is happening, and despite also one thing that we need to look at, which is the instrumentalization and weaponization of faith. Faith is being used to undermine and violate rights across everywhere, especially in this country, unfortunately. I speak as a Mexican, I see that as well, right? So fundamentalisms are being used to attack those who are the least to blame from what is happening with inequality, with what is happening with climate change, what is happening with conflict. So that being said, I think the most important and emphatic point is the fact that we need the migrant voices here. I love everyone who's involved in the defense of migrant rights, including myself, our members, our partners. But at the end of the day, there's a really significant gap of not having those people who are being affected the most in the room. So in that sense, faith can be combined with a clear demand that there needs to be representation, participation, and inclusion from those who are suffering the most of the ground. And especially now, apart from having faith and hope, what is very, very important is for us to stick together. We see a dismantling of those solidarity movements that I mentioned. We see a dismantling intentionally of even this body is under danger, right? Let it be the compact itself is under danger. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda. We're in a drastically different world than what it was 10 years ago after the adoption of the SDGs, for example. Because all of these agendas, the compact, it's on process of its own. It's linked to a sustainable development agenda that more than 10 years ago, we promised that we would transform the world. And that is not happening, unfortunately. I thought that 10 years later in these rooms, we'll be in a totally different scenario, and that's not taking place. But it's precisely for that matter that one, more migrant voices need to be included in these spaces. If states are not enabling that possibility, we must enable that possibility, but not only as sectors, as partners in resistance, as partners in demanding that people who are suffering the most are here in this hall discussing that, demanding the non-regression aspect, demanding safe and regular pathways, demanding the universal access to these basic services, right? Countering narratives of hate, the role that technology, which was mentioned here, that has in all of these different scenarios. And the most important thing at the moment, and I see that there's a lot of negativity, there's a lot that's taking place, but those who have faith in their hearts, no matter what God you believe in, is the fact that there's a possibility of doing things differently. And our members on the ground, one of them here who collected a beautiful story of a women migrant here that I will share with you, it's to come up with creativity responses on how we can do that resistance together. But we need to stop working in silos. We need to stop coming up with ideas that are too overwhelming, that might not lead us in the right direction. And we need to partner with those governments and with those other sectors that might not necessarily usually come here to make that resistance practical, to make that resistance urgent. No, the needs on the ground are very clear. And of course, we need to be hopeful about this. There's a lot of harm. My heart breaks every day that I see what is happening with the ICE raids, what is happening in the criminalization of migrants and the movements that accompany them. But we definitely need to stop for a minute also and say, okay, we need to work together, we need to have hope, and we have tons of ideas and ways to make that happen. I think that's what we need to highlight it, and not only continue the discussion, but the actions back home and continue to be connected. One thing, having done these kinds of spaces, and I'll shut up because I'm exceeding the 5 minutes, having done these kinds of spaces from a very young age, I've done this for a long time, for 15 years, coming to the United Nations, it's always like side events and discussions are isolated events, and that shouldn't happen. We should have overcome the ways in which we're having these spaces precisely because we want to work together. And I think that's something that's extremely necessary as of right now. So thank you for the invitation, and well, look forward to continue to be connected, as I know this is the first time that this assembly is taking place. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl. To end our expert inputs, which is where we're at now in the program. And I think we will pivot just a little bit because we received several very good questions in the chat as people were speaking. We have quite a sizable group online, and I believe we will pass it and open up for Q&A here. We would like to also present to you some of the key messaging and asks that we had prepared preliminarily, and then see if there might be some additions from the room at this moment, but we will also keep that document open until the end of today, so it can serve for anyone who wants to access it going into the meetings this week. So that was our approach to do this with the limited time that we have. Again, a warm thank you to all of the speakers today. We heard from so many different angles, so many different topics, all at the intersection of migration and gender, what needs to be considered. And so I believe we'll pass it now to the colleagues online so we can pose the questions that were shared in the chat. Yes, Georgia, if you may facilitate that part, that would be fantastic.
So we received a couple questions online. Would we prefer I read them all? Or?
Yes, why don't we do that? And see if they're for a specific speaker, we could highlight that as well.
So the first question we received was from Sheila Salim. And they asked, for persons with disabilities, what forms of disabilities do we get responses from?
So this might be a question for our first speaker, Elham.
Gabriella Simpson asked, how does the victim narrative among migrants of color in the media become complicated when considering intersectional issues such as race, gender, and class? Riaz asked, In protracted displacement, girls face severe barriers to secondary education due to movement restrictions, safety risks, and lack of accredited pathways. What concrete actionable commitments can international actors make to ensure access to recognized secondary education for refugee girls, not just informal learning? And then I believe we have one more. Noel asked, how do feminist and post-colonial critiques reveal that the Geneva Convention structurally excludes climate-induced displacement?
That's for Christina, but maybe one of us can take this as well. Thank you so much, Georgia. Maybe we'll pass it back to Elham first for the question regarding disability.
Thank you so much. I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Is this just because from what I read, it means like if we have received responses from which groups of people with disabilities? Is that how you understand it?
Yes. Yeah.
But I have not done any research, and that's actually one of the gaps that I have been highlighting about which groups of people with disabilities. But maybe I just use this opportunity to mention that would be super important to make sure that any research includes the diverse group of women with disabilities, including women who have sensory impairment, like deaf or blind, women with intellectual disabilities, women with mental health conditions, women with physical disabilities, and then also, of course, women with albinism and other groups. So it should be overarching and all-inclusive. But if they can clarify further, I'm happy to respond. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we'll hear a response from the individual that posed the question to begin with. I believe the next question was about narratives, if I recall correctly.
Yes. How does the victim narrative among migrants of color in the media become complicated when considering intersectional issues such as race, gender, and class?
Yes,
we have yes, Martina, please. And we also have another media expert here in the room with us as a participant, so we'll pass it to them first. But go ahead, Martina, please.
Yeah, it just actually before I just have 5 minutes, so I haven't talked about intersectionality, but this is also one aspect that it's super important and it's missing in the media coverage of migration nowadays, because we all know that different layers of our identity can represent a privilege or an aspect of marginalization on this point. And this is like very interesting that is focusing on women of color, because this also open all the discourse, the topic that it's a little bit long to talk now, but all about xenophobia. And for example, when I piloted a training on this topic in South Africa was really relevant. And most of the discussion were around this specific issue of intersectionality and xenophobia on this specific topic. So thank you for highlighting it. And yes, definitely, it's increased the layers of discrimination.
Would you like to add?
I try to answer.
Yes. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Marcela Gaviu. I'm from Argentina. I'm a gender communication specialist, and I made a podcast about women on migration who go through the Darien. And now I'm reporting women who are deported and forced return. I think if we work with human rights with this perspective, we just have to make the intersectional narratives this part of our work, because the reality that leaves these women in particular
is the difference between other experience. And for me, it's very important that that being the women who speak, not me like a journalist. I always say that. I'm going to say that on Friday too. But it's very important because sometimes some narratives are built there in the perception of some privileged journalists who have, we have a home, computer in our house, a family when we return to our home, and you just put in the feel, in the skin of the other person. So when you work with this point of view, you must do it. The intersectional is there, and you just have to hear what they say to you and try to express with their voices.
Thank you so much for your input. And you mentioned our event on Friday. We actually do have a specified event on this topic as part of our Global Gender and Migration Forum on media public perceptions and narratives. And you've already got a sneak peek of two of the speakers here. So if you would like to join us, it will be virtual at 10 o'clock. And I'll be happy to provide further information there. The next, there was an additional question regarding informal learning in the context of displacement specifically. So I might pass this one to Morshid. If you have any insights on, if you would like to respond to this from the context of Cox's Bazar, please.
Right. Thank you. Sorry, I think the question was mostly focused on access to education for the Rohingya women, right?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. So from my ground perspectives and first-hand experience, I have I'm now working with Plan International as Global Youth Ambassador, and as a part of my my work with them, I'm going to work on advocacy projects, which is under terms of education, access to education for the Rohingya youths. As a part of these projects, I have also been thinking to how we can bring the quality and accredited educations in the refugee camps in Bangladesh. It has been too long times from the times of 2000, like 17 and before to the 1991, people from Myanmar came here in Bangladesh called registered refugee, also remain same with the same situation. So despite do international efforts and national efforts, there is no changes. The situation remains the same without getting access to quality and accredited educations. So some things that we can bring the education is to bring in the global actors uh, and NGO, INGO, governments and policymakers working with the education issues together to change the policy, the national policy of Bangladesh. Due to the given national policy of Bangladesh, they make like strict the getting access to higher education for the Rohingya community. They give a terms called displacement. So now the refugee, unless being refugee, displaced people are not eligible to get refugee rights. So this is something that's make barrier and like to get access to educations, accredited and quality education for the Rohingya community here in. As mentioned, this is something we have only one possible way, bringing the access to quality education and accredited educations, bringing together global platforms, global actors, policymaker, and national stakeholders to change the policy, so that we have the option to bring solution behind this problem. Yeah, thank you so much for the question.
Thank you so much, Murshid, for bringing again the perspective from on the ground from Cox's Bazar's refugee camp in Bangladesh to this discussion. We had another question, and this was about feminist and post-colonial critiques with regards to the Refugee Convention, the structural exclusion of climate-induced displacement. But I wonder if I may also pass this to Kirsten, since you do work in the context of this displacement, and you work in the context of externalization. Where do you see feminist or post-colonial critique, if at all, kind of, I guess, translate into practice, or how can it be used, if we wish, for advocacy messaging that we're trying to do here at this global stage? So kind of bridging the academic into the policy space, if you would like to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, first, it's not in practice. Like, we don't even have the 1951 Refugee Convention respected in its non-feminist, in its colonial version being respected. So the need to do analysis of that and to include a feminist and post-colonial approaches is high, but we also need to just have the basics respected first. And then from there, of course, borders are some of the least transparent spaces that there are, and women are more and more invisibilized, and I highlighted that in our data. So we don't even have a lot of information on where they are, how they're traveling, because they can't access basic services and they can't access basic protections under the 1951 Refugee Convention. So it's very important, and the studies are very important, as the first speaker alluded to, because accessing these people, accessing the information, bringing the refugee and migrant voices is so important, and it is so hard because we're here because they can't be here. They can't be here because of visas, because they don't even have a citizenship. People who are in transit, who are at the borders, are some of the most vulnerable people. And so we need these discourses, but we also just really need the very, very basics to be upheld first. And yeah, and then of course there should be calls to action from all sides and all pressure, and everything that is intersectional is more powerful and more accurate and more true to the reality. And so bringing these experiences, I would just encourage everyone to do that, and from all the sectors. But yeah, we're hoping for non-regression of the basics of the convention.
And I think that very much describes of where we're at right now, at least in the meetings that I've been in so far, is this kind of hope of let's not regress even further. Yet the banners tell us let's talk about progress, right? So there's a little bit of a tension here. I would like to say, if I can add my critique to this as well. We have another question online, and then I would also, of course, like to see if anyone in the room might have a question from Mariam Jami. How can we make these collaborations sustainable beyond the first meeting? So I assume speaking here also specifically about the assembly and possibly the Global Gender and Migration Forum that we're now in the middle of for the second time, and to ensure that diverse and intersectional migrant voices are meaningfully included in the long term. Maybe I'll see if Carol has further insights on this, and then I'm happy to speak as well, and we'll see if there's questions. Yes, also from the room here.
Super important what Kirsten was saying, non-regression. And that should be our standard for everything that we're trying to discuss here. Non-regression in all human rights instruments, but particularly those that still need to both strengthening. I mean, we cannot also lose sight of the target that we need to strengthen those mechanisms, but right now we need to defend that those mechanisms are kept in place. The amount of atrocities we have seen in the past 2.5 years is just, it's just breaking the system. And I think that that should be a standard again, in which all of us are very, very much aware that if we continue to let them do this, the international human rights system is just gonna collapse. The UN is gonna collapse. Maybe I'm sounding very alarmist, but I do see that happening in the current context that we are. And we see, we were just with the Deputy Secretary General right now. She says she's a drought in good leadership, not only in those hotspots, right, that usually have governance issues, but in those countries that we expected to look up to, right? That is no longer there. We're actually seeing the craziest responses coming from those leaders. So non-regression is one, demanding better leadership, selecting better leadership, education, awareness. But I think across the spectrum is the fact that there's hope. There's hope if we work together, if we are informed, and if we play different roles. There's roles in communications, there's roles with churches, there are roles with the private sector, there's roles to play with unions, there's roles to play with the youth and with the people on the move themselves. Stop tokenism, real engagement for those people on the ground. And talking about those spaces that are shrinking, because they're removing those spaces in which we previously had access, and we cannot let that happen. That's why I said resist in unity, but resist with tons of information and with roles to play. Otherwise, we're gonna be in 4 years coming back, hopefully, right? Because
that's the other question.
That's the other question.
That's a
We're
big
gonna
question.
be
Yeah.
back here in 4 years. We're gonna be here in the 4 years with the Sustainable Development Goals. I insist on that fact because it's a whole process that is looking at an overall range of issues that not only align to human rights. And I will be very heartbroken if 4 years later we're having the same or worse discussions that we should be having. So those are a little bit of my advices in that regard that could be put in place.
Yes, thank you so much. I think as you said, like the different roles that we might have to play, right? And the talk around multi-stakeholder engagement. And this is one of the reasons, if I may say, like why with this assembly, we had an open call for anyone who would like to speak, for anyone that our call to let's have this conversation around gender and migration, who that resonated with, no matter where they are. And that's what we see represented in the speakers that we selected, that ultimately are here today, from the very lived realities to those of us that engage in these UN spaces quite frequently. So I think we're certainly committed to continue these discussions. And one way to do that is, as I presented at the very beginning of the session, is through the Gender Migration Index that we developed. This is how we're tracking progress, although right now we're tracking regression. And that's pretty much where we're at as well. But that is one of the tools that at least we have developed, where we're saying we're committed in a sustainable way, and we invite anyone to join us in this effort. We have a question in the room as well from Daniel, please.
Thank you. It's Daniel Nauyok. I'm a professor at Columbia University. I teach migration, refugee studies, and UN studies. And I have one short remark on the one question actually that received on the convention, and then I have a question for everybody. So I actually teach feminist critiques of the convention, and I mean not on climate. I mean climate is anyway out, so we don't need even feminist and decolonizing narratives. Climate is like out of the convention. But I think it's a good reminder, the question that we need to think about how to analyze existing policy frameworks also through a gender lens, right? Like what many critiques have argued for many years, that the Refugee Convention, which is gender neutral at the face of it, I mean, there's some he and some language issues, but these are not major, but is that the idea of political persecution, of torture, right, are often modeled on the idea that the Secret Service comes and puts you into a cell and pulls your fingernails out, and that is often done more to men. And for example, that structured state-sponsored rape and sexual violence used in several concepts, which is very similar, but again, was very different and very much harder. So these very state-sponsored sexual violence is not part of that. we look at decolonizing ideas, that what we heard from our colleague from the border violence network, that the text of the convention is like everybody, there's no limit, right? Every country that where an asylum seeker steps foot on and says, I would like to apply for asylum, has to go through the process. And if found that this person have a credible fear of persecution, then they should be granted asylum. There's no cap. But what one is doing more and more, of course, is that what my colleague David Fitzgerald calls a catch-22, where they pay lip service to the overall commitments, but then they actually try to do a lot to externalize, to push people back, to make sure there's a non-entree regime that people cannot come in. And as we heard, that has very gendered consequences, right? So that's my comment on that. And then the question for everybody, I'm usually a toxic optimist. However, so I have two caps, one migration cap and one UN cap, and we haven't heard a lot about, when we talk about gender and the UN, right? It's the anti-topic these days.
Yes.
But the US, the reason the US withdrew from the SDGs, like why? But okay, with gender and climate as at the top of the wokeness scale. And we've seen that through the merger between UN Women and UNFPA, if you read the assessment report that came out last week, right? It's amazing. Basically, the report says we shouldn't merge, it's just because there's attacks on gender. So from the global sphere, you can see, and the US is leading the charge with many, many other institutions that are really pushing back against anything that has gender in its name, let alone in the content. So in that environment, some of the things you said about we need more research, we need more data, that can be done at the very local level. But how do we operate and push, how do we frame things where I mean, everybody here, I think the non-aggression is so key. But I mean, saying we don't want regression, sure, like I signed the petition, but that alone probably won't stop regression happening. So how does the agenda and the discourse and the narratives on gender and migration need to change or need to adjust in this environment? Do we just like say no, stay course, or do we have to like do something different to actually get more people on board and navigate that highly politically sensitive area?
It's a question that I shall think through after this week is over, when I'm going to take a little bit of break from all of this work. And as you can imagine, leading the Center for Migration, Gender and Justice is no easy task these days, right? I mean, the topics that we're addressing are not particularly friendly seen. We did receive ECOSOC accreditation, so hey, that's something that's a positive step, and we're trying to understand what this means for us exactly in this new political climate. I would say for now, stay course, if not push further, because exactly of that. I do see the warning of let's not regress, but I also see opportunities, especially from different stakeholders to continue to progress, if so, right? Because if we are considering this as a multi-stakeholder space, then we see one stakeholder regressing, we're seeing the member states regressing. But what about us as civil society? Actually, I think we've come together stronger. I think we understand our task better, and I think we need to get ready, maybe in different ways, but that would be my call to at the very least keep course, if not push stronger, whatever that might mean. But no, we will not change the name of our organization if that's what you're asking, just so we might get some funding from some organization or be invited to some sort of event that will not happen. And I give you my word on that, and that is recorded here. But thank you for the question. And I would be curious if others have something else to say. I also want to be mindful of time, and there's other meetings that are taking place. So just a quick call if anyone else would like to. Yes, yeah. Please, Kristen.
I'm not an expert on narratives. That's not what we do. I would leave that to the media people. But I will say that something that's worked for us is the legally binding treaty bodies. So we see that states only really are ever held accountable when it's through the legal route. Otherwise, they do whatever they want up until they get a slap on the wrist from some type of court. So we submit to the different UN treaty bodies. We've had success with CEDAW, for example, who still has a great mandate. And once that is published in their concluding observations, we then take that back down to the national level and try to put that into national court cases or to regional court cases at the European Court of Human Rights. And then sometimes the states in Europe have been found guilty and had to pay fines. And this for us is a huge success, even though it's not changing hearts and minds or narratives, but there is some accountability there. And so for us, we would just try to push it further, use more of the treaty bodies, but then also make sure that it's coming back down to the national level over and over and over again. And that's a best practice that we've had. I don't know about narratives.
We have one more comment or question from our colleague, Ilana.
Yeah, thanks so much, Susan. And sorry, like I've also been very distracted because I don't know if everyone knows that this is all kicking off over there at the moment with the overflow rooms and all this people not being let in, that kind of thing, and civil society. So maybe I just want to say a few quick things about accountability, because now having been in this space for a few years, there is a huge lack of accountability and it only regresses every single year. And so I really appreciate what Kirsten was saying about Kirsten, sorry, about the legality of things and using these legislations and courts. But I think we also missed another big important part, which is voting. And is that, you know, we can come here and talk to the foreign office people of different governments, and they, for the most part, agree with us, but they have no power when it comes to their own governments because the elected officials tell them what to do, and either they quit or they have to just toe the line. And they can do certain things, like, for example, I have a friend at the US mission who's there from the previous one, and he is extremely depressed, but he's doing what he can to protect the migration space from the US administration. He has to do it completely off record, do it by himself, and he's also constantly, you know, a little bit worried about if he's going to get found out and that kind of thing. But so these colleagues also need our support, and really need to take these narratives, like you said, and also the fact that, you know, we have such limited accountability avenues at the global level, we need it to be held at the national and local levels as well. So how can we take these messages down? How can we talk to communities? How can we mobilize to try and even start from the local council level all the way to national voting? Because that's really where the change is going to be.
Thank you so much, Ilana, for bringing up this very important point. And I truly appreciate all of the engagement with the inputs from our expert speakers, making this interactive. I would like to now conclude just by sharing the document that we had prepared with key messages and key asks that, as mentioned, we will leave open until this afternoon, and because we do see this as a collective effort, and we do value everybody's expertise with regards to this. To us, we've always said it, achieving gender justice beyond borders is a collective fight. And we hope that you might consider sharing some insights into this document, ideally by this afternoon. That way we can kind of close and edit the document, and you can feel free to draw on it as you go into sessions today, when you might get, and throughout the week, when you might get a chance to speak and say, actually, can we bring in gender as a perspective? And so this document, I believe, has now been shared in the chat. I wonder if we could also just have it briefly pulled up, or at least a QR code from our colleagues online, so that those that are in the room might be able to scan it if they would like to contribute to this. With that, I would like to say thank you to everyone here. Thank you to those that joined us online. Thanks for everyone's contribution to this important space. This is the first of many that we hope to hold. And again, this is part of our second Global Gender and Migration Forum that came truly out of the belief that we can create spaces for ourselves. And we're very proud to have this happen yet again and see many familiar faces again, and also having created new partnerships through this initiative. So thank you all so much.